So with that, let me introduce the main act. So I want to introduce our panelist, Randy Krosner, whom all of you know from having the many years that he's done this. Randy is the Norm Bobbins Professor of Economics at Chicago Booth. He previously served as Deputy Dean for Executive Programs at Booth and was a governor of the Federal Reserve System from 2006 to 2009. Currently, Randy serves as chair of the Financial Research Advisory Committee for the U.S. Treasury's Office of Financial Research, and he's also a member of the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee. Then Raghu Ramrajan, again, Raghu has done this event many, many times. Raghu is the Catherine Dusack Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at Chicago Booth. Raghu served as the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India from 2013 till 2016, and prior to that, from 2003 to 2006, he was Chief Economist and Director of Research at the IMF. Raghu has done a bunch of research in a variety of areas: banking, corporate finance, and economic development, and especially the role played by finance. He's written many, many path-breaking books, including The Third Pillar, How the State and Markets Hold the Community Behind, and Fault Lines, How Hidden Fractures Still Threaten the World Economy. And our third panelist is Yuran Ma. Yuran is an Associate Professor of Finance and the Pharma Faculty Fellow at Booth. Her work focuses on empirical studies at the intersection of finance and macroeconomics. And she's covered a bunch of topics, including debt contracts and their macroeconomic implications, assets and production activities of non-financial firms, the impact of low interest rates on financial markets, and the role of expectations. So Yuran is a winner of the Alfred Sloan Fellowship, the AQR Institute Young Researcher Award, and the NSF Career Award. And finally, our panelists, we're thrilled to have Kathleen Hayes come back. Kathleen covers the US and global economy and the policymakers who run them. She's one of the top economics reporters and anchors in the country. She's covered the Federal Reserve for more than 30 years at Reuters, Investors Business Daily, CNBC, CNN, and Bloomberg TV and radio. More recently, she expanded her reporting to include not just Fed officials, but also top central bankers in Asia, Europe, and emerging markets. And she's now editor-in-chief at Central Bank Central. So with that, let me turn it over to Kathleen. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Chicago Booth, for inviting me back again. I feel like I'm a kind of an adjunct little satellite floating around, and once a year I get to land here and see all of you and moderate this panel. And you know, it's funny, you could say, oh, there's so much to talk about this year. Well, guess what? Seems like there's a lot to talk about every year. And I want to dive right in. Anyone who was here last year might remember that we were talking about not so much when the Fed would cut rates, but how much more they might have to go. And I think it's almost like one of those sayings that we've started the year with, everybody thought there was going to be a recession at the beginning of 2023. Why did they get it so wrong? What's happening? What's going to happen this year? So I want to start there. And Randy, I want to start with you. Where is the economy now? Where is it going? If anything, it seems to me the surprise has been that labor market still looks pretty strong. Yes, inflation's come down a lot, although some key measures are not quite as low as maybe the Fed needs to see them. What do you see?
Great. I'm delighted to be back again. And you're right. We had talked about, I think all of us in the panel last year thought there was a substantial chance that we'd see some significant slowdown because the Fed was on a path to raise rates. I think I even mentioned that rates get to something with a 5 handle on them. People thought that was insane. How could rates get that high? But of course, they've gotten there, and we've gotten there without having a recession, without the unemployment rate spiking up. This is one of the things that we talked about. I use this phrase, the immaculate disinflation. Could we possibly have inflation come down substantially, the Fed raise rates, without it causing a substantial rise in the unemployment rate? And obviously we've had that. Now, immaculate conceptions and immaculate disinflations don't happen that often. And so I think we got very, very lucky with that. And then the question is, will things be as immaculate going forward? I'm not so sure about that. I'm hopeful, but my concern is that now that finally interest rates are, Fed has interest rates around 5.5%, inflation rate has now come down substantially from its peak. And so basically until about 6 months ago, real interest rates, that is the inflation-adjusted interest rate, was still negative. That inflation was higher than where interest rates were. Same thing for wages. Real wage growth was negative. It was a great time to be hiring people when they were demanding a lot more than they had in the past, and wage increases of on average 4%, but people were selling things at 6 or 7% more. So sure, let's buy more of that input at 4% increased cost when I can sell the output at 6 or 7% more. Things have turned. So now the real wages are growing, which is great for households, but I think that's going to start to reduce demand for labor. And so you're now seeing the inflation rate going down 2-3% depending on, or 3 or so, depending on your favored measure. The wage rates are still growing at around 4. So now you're having some real wage growth. The key will be productivity. Will there be sufficient productivity growth to justify being able to pay people more than the inflation rate? So far, productivity has been pretty good. We'll see if it maintains itself. And then the real interest rate. We haven't seen substantial real interest rates, positive real interest rates, since the global financial crisis, since 20 years ago. And so I think that may also make firms a little bit more wary of investing. Obviously, many of you are in the startup community know it's been a challenge just as nominal rates have gone up, but I think it's going to be it from real rates. So people have talked about hard landing, softish landing. I've introduced the concept of hardish landing. You have to have all 4. And so what that means is that I think we'll see a slowdown probably hitting by the middle of next year. Will it be a formal recession? I'm not so sure about that. That's why I'm not in the hard landing camp, and I never was in the hard landing camp. But I just don't see how we're going to get out this without the unemployment rate moving up a fair amount from where it is, and with economic growth moving down from kind of the screaming level that it's been over the last few months.
Okay, quickly, I just want to clarify a couple of things. You said by the middle of this year, or you said next year?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know, I'm still
writing 2023 on my checks.
Yes.
Yeah, the middle of this year. Sorry.
And you say that it is going to require more active action on the Fed, or just waiting and see what happens?
So I think the Fed's going to hang tough because I mean, if things start really going down, then they'll respond. Or if the inflation rate goes down substantially below 2%, they'll respond.
Okay.
But they don't want to have what happened in the late 70s, early 80s. Of cutting rates too quickly, and then inflation coming back up, and then having to go rates double-digit levels.
Okay, Raghu, next to you, what do you see? And I think you two were in the camp of some more hikes at the beginning of 2023, but you were thinking that it was going to level out. It wasn't going to be, people were talking about 6%, 7%.
Right, we thought it would be somewhere in the 5s. I think that prediction has been right. But I mean, I think it's useful to think about what's made the difference, right? And certainly demand has been stronger than we expected. The surpluses with households, the excess savings has been, by many estimates that are coming out now, higher than we thought they were. That's one support. Wealth effects have been positive. People have seen the stock market, hold its own, in fact, come back up towards the end of the year. So spending as a result of households feeling more flush has also been very supportive. And then there's this incredible fiscal deficit of close to 7% during this year, at a time when the Fed is trying to hold back activity. I mean, this level of fiscal deficit is unprecedented in normal times, and we are in normal times as far as activity goes. So all those have combined. I think what one shouldn't forget is when you look at debt, why haven't higher interest rates bitten more? Part of what's happened is maturities have been pushed out from the corporate sector. During the pandemic, because of easy money, a lot of corporations pushed out maturities. And as a result, the repricing in terms of higher interest rates didn't take place as fast as it normally does. And of course, households are sitting on really 30-year mortgages, so that repricing hasn't happened for them. In fact, they're really happy sitting on 3.5% mortgage rates, when in fact market rates are now 7.5%. So the fact that maturities generally were pushed out has also been beneficial in not skewing or slowing down demand. That's certainly on the demand side. Now, of course, you need substantial supply also to explain the disinflation that's been happening, right? So one, of course, was you had the old snarled supply chains getting fixed. And that has been happening through the year. You see it most in goods prices. Goods prices have inflation has come down. In some cases, used cars, it's been negative. So that has been very supportive in the disinflation. The other thing that we don't pay enough attention to is the supply side. And to some extent, Randy mentioned that productivity growth in the last few quarters has been substantial. And 2.3, 2.5%. And that's extraordinary. And that kind of productivity growth, of course, we need to take some time to understand where that's coming from. It's not ChatGPT, but it's something that's changing. The other thing that we haven't paid enough attention to is the increase in immigration, which has expanded the supply, the labor force somewhat in the last few quarters. Put those together, and you have a growth potential of about 3.5%. When historically you would say the U.S. growth potential is about 2%.
Yeah.
So just these two factors explain why the supply side is not being affected by the strong demand, and you're not getting higher inflation. It's come down. That said, those factors that Randy pointed to, labor markets are still very tight despite all this immigration and supply coming in. Labor markets are very tight. And if you look at the last labor report, wages are still fairly strong.
Yeah.
If you look at Atlanta Fed,
Sure.
it's north of 5% still.
Yeah.
So that would suggest the services inflation, which is the other big component of inflation, not coming down as fast, stuck around the 4% level, which means the hope that it'll be immaculate is still a hope. That it could be that it takes more. Not necessarily Fed doing more, but the Fed staying till it sees some slack in the labor market. And that's why I think the hopes of Fed cuts in March are way premature.
So, Yaron, you can feel free to jump on anything they said, but I particularly wanted to get to you because Yaron's done some very interesting research on many things, but errors in forecasting. It's a perfect thing to ask about today when everyone's saying, what did everybody get so wrong about 2023? And she doesn't just say, well, because of this. No. She looks at numbers. She torches them. She grinds all this stuff out. So what's the lesson from what you have done that is applicable to what we're looking at now in 2024?
We learn from data. We don't torture data. So first, after our colleague Lars Peter Hansen got the Nobel Prize, he sometimes started his public talks by saying, when the Nobel Prize was announced to the press, people saw there was Jim Fama, there was Bob Shiller, and there was that other guy. And he was that other guy. I'm being that other guy today. It's not a bad situation to be. So when we look at forecasts, as Kathleen mentioned, sometimes they're off. Team Transitory was off. Recession call for 2023 was off. Pessimism about recovery from COVID was off. But of course, future is uncertain, so we can't see everything exactly, except if you're these super forecasters who sometimes time travel from the future. The question is whether there are systematic, predictable errors that people make, and that's what we study. I remember David Booth said at a recent Booth event that if he says the market is inefficient, Fama will wash his mouth with soap. I've seen Jean come to lunch with toothbrush, but not to brush others. So when we look at the data over the past 30, 40 years, there have been systematic errors, especially in interest rate forecasts about Fed funds rates as an example. And what are these errors? One is that over the past 30, 40 years, people systematically overestimated Fed funds rate. The realized Fed funds rate turned out to be lower than the forecast of professional forecasters and also lower than the Fed's own forecast. Why was that the case? Well, one, people underestimated the downward trend in real rate, and the other is professional forecasters in particular underestimated how aggressively the Fed would react when output is low and employment is low. Now today, do we think that the forecast might be overestimating Fed funds rate in the future? Well, right now the consensus forecast is at about 4.4, 4.5 for the end of 2024. I think the situation today has two features that might be slightly different from what we saw for the past 30, 40 years. One was that the data was for a period of declining inflation, and also for a period where the Fed was primarily, I think, focused on output, sometimes output growth and productivity growth was sluggish. Right now, the Fed, for the first time in 30 years, is very focused on defending its credibility to fight inflation. Anchoring inflation expectations is very important. So at least when I look at the dots, I would suspect that they may err on the side of being cautious and being high. But as Randy said, if the economy slows down, if inflation slows down and output and employment growth becomes lower than expected, based on historical data, it is not unlikely that they will act pretty aggressively. But I think the precondition is that inflation gets under control, credibility is maintained and restored.
I want to ask something about what the signaling from the Fed. And it's, I mean, I've always been a big fan of Federal Reserve officials speaking. I think it's good to know what they think, and it's good to see how the various views. And speaking of the dots, you know, the message was much more mixed at the last dot meeting and than it had been when they were all saying that we're going to have to raise rates, we're going to have to raise them fast and high. So I think some people are kind of wondering, you know, is Jay Powell, are they really committed to keeping rates higher for longer, higher enough, or are they more in the camp now, well, you know, it's better and, you know, maybe it's just a little more, keep the waters smoother if we, you know, let it stay high, and maybe we won't cut right away. But I think is that kind of the risk that they think they've got the credibility now, and they just, you know, take a little too long and take the risk of not doing enough. And the markets are obviously betting. I mean, Bragg said before we started, can't see a rate cut in March. I don't know why people in the market see it, except that they've been guessing or predicting the Fed to be more that way, more dovish than they have for a while.
And so, yeah, I agree. I think the markets got ahead of themselves. I think Jay's press conference in December, maybe he got a little out over his skis or whatever the metaphor was, and getting people too excited that the Fed's, not only is the Fed done, but now the Fed is sort of on a clear path to go down. I think it's unlikely that they're going to raise rates further, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be cutting rates in March. And you know, there are so many different ways to measure inflation. You know, talking about torturing the data. So you know, you got the consumer price index, you got the personal consumption index, you've got the median, you got the core, you got this, you got that. So you know, if you want, you can say that inflation is actually less than 2% right now, or you can get a number that's over 4%. So people are, I think, getting excited that the Fed is looking at the optimistic part, but there were a lot of Fed speakers who came out in the subsequent week who kind of pushed back on that and said, we're not there yet. Let's not make that assumption. And I think they really do have to see the inflation rate come down consistently and substantially to closer to 2%. The headline is going to bounce around. We're going to get some more info on that. And this has been a little bit of a challenge for Europe because there was a tick up in headline inflation because energy prices had gone up. And part of that is because they ended a subsidy program that they had for energy. So you're going to see a lot of bouncing around of certain energy prices, of some food prices. The Fed's going to look through that. But the question is, how much can they look through that without worrying about the expectation issue that Jeroen had mentioned, that if the Fed now says, oh, well, yeah, we were talking about transitory before, we weren't right on that, but now we know this stuff is transitory, are people really going to believe that? And I think they have to be worried about that. So as the headline number sort of bounces around a lot, I don't think it's going to come down quite as much. They're really going to be focusing on that kind of core number that strips out the volatile food and energy sectors, as I think I've mentioned here before. It's only economists who could think about a consumer price index where you don't worry about people spending money on staying warm or staying cold or even eating. What would that be relevant for the consumption basket? But the reason for doing that is because there's usually more information content in stripping out those more volatile sectors. But even there may be more information content in that, but we don't fully understand the expectation process. And people look a lot at gasoline prices.
Yeah. Well, I want to bring you in on this because, well, two things. You have looked at inflation expectations. When Randy and I were both at the Cleveland Fed's Financial Stability Conference was that November?
Yes.
Yes. And Loretta Mester unfortunately, she's got to retire. This stupid rule, you can be at the Board of Governors till you're 100, but at the Federal Reserve regional banks, you have to retire when you're 65. Anyway, so we're going to lose Loretta. And she made it clear, and then she'd spoken in New York just a couple weeks before, how much weight she puts on expectations. And they too, at the Cleveland Fed, look at all kinds of expectation measures. In a nutshell, what are inflation expectations telling us right now?
Yeah, so the importance of inflation expectations is one of the most important contributions of the Chicago School for Macroeconomics. When inflation expectations are unanchored, then people respond much more strongly to any inflation surprises that they see. Right now, if you look at inflation expectations, the short-term inflation expectations are still somewhat high, it's coming down. The long-term inflation expectations, say 5-year inflation expectations, have been relatively anchored even through the past couple of years, and that's quite important. Where do inflation expectations come from? It comes from a combination of policy communications, like whatever it takes and whatever Powell says, and personal experiences, especially for households. The personal experience part is somewhat helping the Fed because most households lived through a period of very low inflation, except for old folks who still recall the 70s, and their inflation expectations actually have moved up more than the young folks who are more used to.
Did you just call me old folks?
No, not pointing to you specifically.
You're forever young, Randy. You're forever young.
And also when the Fed was coming out of the 70s and 80s, long-term inflation expectations took a while to come down as actual inflation, realized inflation came down. So anchoring inflation expectations is really important, and that's why I think, as Randy said, there's always the risk that there's another supply shock. Inflation might go back up again. That will be very detrimental to their credibility, and there's, I think, reason to be cautious for the moment.
Paul Volcker, I remember in his, I think his mid-80s, famously said that he was in mature middle age. So
okay.
That's one you can all think about. In terms of, there's so many things I want to talk to you guys about, but shall we mention his book, The Shameless Plug for Raghu Rajan, his latest book, Monetary Policy and Its Unintended Consequences. And one of the reasons I love it is because he has a lot of stuff in a book that isn't 300 pages. No, and there's a lot of very powerful points in here. Now, we'll talk about his next new book. But unintended consequences of monetary policy. It seems to me from the pandemic years we could find lots. But one of the things you gently touch on is the politics. And I want you, because a lot of people, certainly Fed officials don't want to talk about that. Ex-Fed officials often don't want to talk about it. But there does seem to be, in a couple of different ways, it's not direct pressure. And it's not like Republicans and Democrats. And in fact, when Donald Trump tried to pressure Powell, and that just seems, this is more subtle and I think more dangerous for the Fed.
You know, this is an election year, right?
It sure is.
And so it's on everybody's mind, what is the Fed thinking now? Officially, they're not thinking about it. But, I mean, it'd be hard to say the Fed certainly doesn't want to engineer a recession. Obviously the Democratic members of the Fed are even less likely to want to engineer that. But how do you achieve that soft landing, right? And this is the problem, that every time Powell says, okay, well, maybe we don't have to be so tough. Maybe we will start cutting rates as inflation comes down because we don't want to be as constraining on the economy. We're looking at some level of real rates, so as inflation comes down, even we may be willing to cut. Markets are desperately trying to anticipate this. I mean, there's a huge fear of missing out in the markets. We want to be first off the starting blocks. And so they are essentially reading very much. And this is what you see. Again and again, Powell trying to reassure that the Fed is not going to over-tighten. And immediately that sets off a race. And then all the Fed presidents come out and say, no, we didn't mean that. We meant we'll wait and see. And can you have it both ways?
Pushing rates down because Powell's obviously not going to be tough enough.
Exactly. So that's precisely the problem. And what, in a sense, the Fed is also fighting the markets.
Yeah.
Because the markets aren't making the Fed's task easier. What would be nice is the Fed says, don't worry too much, we're going to get there, but don't react to it. Don't react, don't push bond yields down, don't push the stock market up. And if that happens, yes, we'll get there. But if the markets react in the other way, they start celebrating, it will take the Fed longer to get there. And that's the problem. That, that will have the very effect the Fed is trying to avoid.
Yeah.
Which is basically a far sharper slowdown than it wants.
There you go. Okay, now Randy, I want you to get in here quickly on, because we're on this question of monetary policy and its unintended consequences. And again, you can buy his book online, physical copy, and if you had one now, he could autograph it for you. Anyway, financial stability, we were at a conference, monetary policy, unintended consequences. You can say that SVB, their management mismanaged their maturities and all that, but you could also probably say that if the Fed had not waited so long to raise rates, and so it had to move so quickly, and you remember Esther George, former president of Kansas City Fed, dissented, I think it was June of 2022. She said because she thought that the households, consumers, businesses were going to have a hard time adjusting to these quick rate hikes. Anyway, they might still be here. Credit Suisse might still be here if SVB hadn't gone down. So is there a financial stability issue in unintended consequences of monetary policy?
Sure, this is sort of classic unintended consequences of monetary policy. There used to be this theory that was bandied about a so-called separation theorem, that you'd have monetary policy do its thing and make sure inflation is low or fight inflation, and then macroprudential policy and regulatory policy would do its thing to make sure that the financial system is stable. I think SBV made it really clear you can't separate these two things out. They're going to be related to each other. And as Madhav had mentioned, last year I joined the Bank of England's Financial Stability Committee, and my first set of meetings were in the first week of March. And SVB had a UK subsidiary.
Great time.
So, and you also may remember that I was at the Fed during the global financial crisis, and if you can go back my history, my first time in Washington was fall of 1987 when we had the stock market crash. So I've got a history of this sort of thing. And so I think thinking through these consequences is extremely important. Because, as you said, there are a lot of different causes. It's easy to pick out one thing or another. But whenever anything is changing quickly, there are going to be challenges for management. I mean, you guys know this in running companies. When things are going along the same way they've always been, it's relatively easy to manage. When something's moving and changing very rapidly, it's much more challenging to manage that. You need to be creative in thinking about the what-ifs, thinking about the alternatives, doing kind of stress testing. And we didn't do that in the US. The UK, actually this is before I got there, so I get no credit for this. The Bank of England's stress scenario that they ran last year was about, well, what if interest rates do something crazy, like go to 5 or 6%? And they tried to look through the consequences of that. So I think that was a very smart thing to try to do. Did they get everything perfect? Of course not. No one got everything perfect. But it was useful to look at that. And so you're always going to have management challenges in the markets when something is moving quickly. And I think that's something that is an important lesson for supervisors to have, regardless of what the regulation is. If something moves fast, there's going to be a lot more uncertainty around it. There's going to be a much bigger management challenge, and you're much more likely to make mistakes. And so that's exactly when you should either have stress tests about it, or you should have the supervisors and regulators looking much more carefully, which they weren't doing.
Now, Yaron, you have done some innovative research on this whole question of the unintended consequences of monetary policy that gets away from the banks and gets away from the Fed's going to do and gets right to innovation and what's happening there. It's very powerful research and some very powerful results.
Yeah, so 55 years ago, Milton Friedman made one of the most influential presidential speeches at the American Economic Association about monetary policy, and he was saying that monetary policy affects the real economy, but the effects should be in the near term. Monetary policy will not affect longer term productive capacity of the economy. This past summer, I was asked to speak at Jackson Hole, and for that, I looked at the effects of monetary policy on innovation, which is one of the potential ways for monetary policy to have longer term effects. So as we know, innovation, like any investment, can be affected by economic conditions. When the Fed tightens, for example, demand slows down, financial conditions tighten, these things, we already know the tighter financial market and lower demand tend to slow down innovation, and that's actually the case in the data. So when monetary policy is tighter, even before the recent episode, historically, when monetary policy tightens, you see slowdown in innovation expenditures like R&D spending, VC investment, and then later slowdown in innovation output, for example, if you measure it by patents, and then that may have longer-term real effects on the economy. And so the magnitudes are actually quite large, even historically, and then most recently we've seen, as an example, VC investment has declined by 60% since rate hikes started. Of course, there might have been some froth and correction as of 2021 and correction after that, but that has really affected most sectors of the startup space, and to think that has no real effects seems not so plausible. But what's really interesting here is that these real effects will take a while to play out. It takes about a year or two for monetary policy to fully transmit into innovation expenditures, another 2 to 3 years then to innovation output, and then another 5 years to aggregate output. So it's possible that what we're seeing now is not just transitory, just about today. It may have longer term effects.
Just a side point on this. I mean, sometimes there's a sense that there is a Chicago school where there is a theology, and we all go and genuflect at the altar of Milton Friedman. And they were great economists, and they set a pattern. But of course, science progresses by overturning the received wisdom. And that's how we are a university, not a religion. And to some extent, Yoren's work reflects that. She is, taking data to ask a question, was Friedman right? And she's saying, well, maybe not so on this particular issue. And I think that's just an example of how we progress, and I think it's worth noting that.
Tune into capitalism.
What's that?
More. Tune into capitalism for more. For how Chicago School evolves.
AI, artificial intelligence, huge. Alex, the CEO of Alex Partners, was on yesterday on one of the financial news networks saying how everybody's investing in, and there's kind of anxiety versus opportunity for CEOs. And then I think it was Accenture, one of their big people, was on saying it's going to be $8 to $10 trillion of the, so AI. And I was just speaking to someone who's here today who is stepping back, kind of a quantitative guy and looking for opportunities, staying away from it right now. Where's the value, and where's the growth? So I want to start with you again, Yaron, because you again bring some interesting points about what the potential opportunity, but what the potential people were worried about the threat too. So what is it that you see about AI and what we should be aware of as we watch progress, and certainly from the impact on the economy and the country, and also, again, for people who are thinking, hey, you jump in?
Yeah, so to extend my lineage of the Chicago School, I also follow the footprints of Ronald Coase to try to think about the organizations of economic activities and by extension, the society sometimes. So let's first go back to 150 years ago, to the Second Industrial Revolution, which had a profound impact on our world. At the time, what were people saying about industrialization? People were saying, one, technical unemployment. Keynes was famous for popularizing this. Second, the impending rise of large firms that will dominate society. And third, the end of capitalism. Now, if you look at what people say about AI, people say about technical unemployment, the dominance of big tech and big firms, and the potential end of capitalism, which Sam Altman said in one of the interviews. What has happened to these predictions about industrialization? Well, technical unemployment probably has happened less than we thought. We found new things to do. For example, in fact, industrialization enabled the migration from manufacturing to services. And Keynes actually thought that there would be so much mechanization that by the generation of his grandchild, there will be entire human liberation from work. That has not happened either. So probably we'll find more work to do for ourselves. Then the dominance of large firms, that actually has happened. So I looked at the data on the size distribution of all US companies for the past 100 years, and it turns out that the dominance of the largest firms has been a perennial trend for the past century. 50 years ago, 50% of US output came from about 10,000 companies. Now 50% of US output comes from only less than 2,000 companies. Lenin was a strong believer of the inevitability of large companies. He did some calculation for the 1910s that the largest 1% enterprises accounted for 50% of the output at that time. Now if you do that calculation, the largest 1% enterprises account for about 80% of the output. We've come a long way. That is a trend that dominated the past century, so the organizational production might change. Some people think that AI will be able to capture more implicit knowledge and enable large-scale production even more. Now comes to extension of that, the end of capitalism. Why might these things end capitalism? One concern was that the dominance of large firms, for example, will lead to concentration of power and wealth. Or the communists said that that will lead to the inevitability of planning, because planning will become so efficient when you have all these industrial technologies. That has not fully materialized. Planning is not, there's still the role for the invisible hand, as Hayek said. So predicting social change is very difficult. It maybe capitalism still has resilience.
It has a chance. Although I must say, if they've already got all that concentration of smaller amounts of big companies producing all the output, I don't see how AI that's already happened. In terms of, quickly, because this is one of our audience questions, how the AI engine will impact the U.S. job market this year versus the next 5. Again, is it too early to say? You know, what's the answer?
So distinguishing the hype from actuality is tough in these cases, right? I mean, if you look at what's actually happened, not much. We've all tried ChatGPT and then said, okay, interesting. Some of us continue using it as starters, but you know, is anybody going to write an entire article using ChatGPT? Probably not, right? So it's going to be an aid for some time. I think some companies are using it already for things like consumer services, but really helping employees rather than actually displacing employees. Will displacement occur? Of course. There will be some displacement. Every technology does that. But usually, as Joran put it, much slower than we think. It takes time for companies to figure out how to use it well, to trust the technology so it doesn't, you know, do the hallucination and so on. It will happen. But there will be some displacement. There will be a lot of work augmentation, you know, taking some of the grunt work out. You know, you see Bloomberg already putting out reports, annual reports summarized. It's doing that largely automatically. So that's an example where, yes, some jobs will be displaced, but there'll be a whole set of new jobs also created. I think David O'Toole at MIT says since 1940, 60% of the jobs we have today didn't exist then. And so new jobs will be created, some jobs will be lost, and existing jobs will be augmented. This is going to happen. This happened with every technology. It'll happen with this. What is the pace at which it'll happen? Maybe it's faster with AI than with some of the other technologies, but we don't know. And you know, one interesting point that The Economist put out way back is the first telephone exchange was thought of in the early 20th century. 1918, I think, was when it was actually put together. The last telephone operator lost their job in 1986. Wow. So it took a fair amount of time before eventually everything was absorbed. And that's just an example of how technology actually takes time. Yes, there are some fast movers, but eventually society gets it. Again, the jury is out on AI.
Okay.
I think it'll help. It's already helping in a bunch of places, but whether it'll create mass displacement, probably not for the next 5 to 10 years, and then we'll see.
Well, I have this thing as an aside. I don't like to talk to computers. When I call and I want customer service, I just insist I'm going to get a human being. And then when I get the customer service person on the phone, I thank them for their job. I tell them I'm going to call their company and tell them what a good job they're doing to maintain people. So that's why one of my little skepticisms. Randy, I want to throw you a totally different kind of question. We've got a lot of questions here about commercial real estate and what's going on there. And again, I hearken a lot to former Federal Reserve officials. Remember Eric Rosengren, who was at the Boston Fed so long and so ably, was something he watched very closely. And it is, everything looks fine, except, you look at corporate credit and some leverage, and especially people are worried about commercial real estate, and we've got some questions on that. What do you see?
We can ask AI about that. It will say it is a problem. Yeah, it's a major problem, and it's, you can see that whether you're in Chicago or pretty much most cities. New York, not quite as much, but San Francisco also, an enormous transformation, both because of the pandemic and its consequences, because the labor markets have changed completely. So, before the pandemic, the notion that you would even negotiate with a potential worker how many days a week they would come in, that just wasn't, you just never thought about that. Of course someone's going to come in 5 days a week, and maybe even more than that. Now that's one of the key things that potential workers ask. You want me to come in 2 days a week? I don't know about that.
Yeah.
So obviously an enormous, and I think that's a permanent change. Maybe it's not 2 or 3, but people have changed. In some sense, what they've realized is the type of structure that academics have in their work lives, because we can, especially with the internet, we can work from anywhere, and academics tend to work a lot, but they often are not in the office. I think at Booth and University of Chicago in general, we're in the office much more than many other places, but having that kind of flexibility is something that people really, really value, and I don't think that's going away. So you're not going to see demand suddenly come back for commercial real estate. Also, it's not just that you're seeing a decline in demand for commercial real estate. The types of office buildings that people want are very different. So new office buildings actually are in fairly high demand, because to get people to come back into the city centers, you have to offer a lot of amenities. So super class A new offices, they're doing okay, but anything below that is in a lot of trouble. And there's an enormous amount of exposure that medium and small size banks have to this. They're starting to do some provisioning. We'll start to get a lot more information about that, about the provisioning, when banks start making their reporting their earnings, starting on Friday and then in the next few weeks. But clearly that's going to be a major issue. And I haven't even mentioned the significant increase in interest rates. So when people have to refinance, and they don't have 30-year mortgages on those kinds of things, it's a much shorter horizon. So you can't hide in long-term financing quite as long. And so that's going to be a headwind, certainly for the banks. But it's one of the most advertised ones. Certainly, people have been talking about it for a while. I think the regulators are aware of it. I think boards of directors are aware of it. So I don't think it's going to happen suddenly. I think it's something that, in principle, could be controlled because people are aware of it. But it's going to be a real problem for many small and medium-sized banks.
Okay, now I want to do a little bit of a lightning round on at least one item, and then I want to go on to the international. But I think it's nice to start with geopolitics. Is it a risk? And of course, overnight, U.S. Navy planes shot down some Houthi drones, and people were waiting for that to happen. So I'm gonna start. Actually, I'm gonna start with you, Raghu, on this. What are we looking at? We got two wars, Middle East and Ukraine. Taiwan election is a totally different kind of thing, but it's out there. Everywhere you look, it seems there's something. And so, a more condensed answer. What are those risks? How would you answer that question? How does that affect the outlook for 2024? There's so many of them.
Well, there's so many risks, right? Perhaps the biggest risk is in this country. What happens in the election? in towards the end of this year, because that will make a huge difference in how the U.S. is viewed in the rest of the world and what expectations there are of U.S. policy going forward, depending on which candidate comes back in. But of course, there are all sorts of concerns way before that. What happens in Taiwan in this week's election? Because if you get a Taiwanese president who actually pushes harder on the separation route, it complicates U.S.-China relationships infinitely. And of course, what's been happening recently is the U.S. and China are talking a lot more. It wouldn't seem that way when you parse the news, but they are talking. They're trying to say, let's not break up. We can't afford to break up. There's so many things we have to work together on. And of course, those conversations are taking place, and those would get disrupted tremendously if there is change in Taiwan, which is significant. Again, hopefully, better sense prevails all through. The war in the Gaza Strip and whether that expands. Hezbollah comes in, Iran comes in, and then we've got a really serious war. If you look at it, energy prices haven't been affected so far, in part because enormous supply coming from the U.S., especially from shale, but also a sense that this is a contained war.
Right.
If it doesn't become a contained war and you have energy prices going through the roof, it's an entirely different ballgame across the world. I think that there are all these risks, but again, I would say that, they're manageable, but, who knows?
Randy?
Sure. This is, as I sometimes have said, to get the immaculate disinflation and everything to work out perfectly, everything has to go right. And I don't really see everything going right in the next year. There are just too many negative shocks that could come in. Now, fortunately, people have at least to some extent been prepared for some of the or are preparing for some of the shocks, but not for sort of further breakout of kind of a broader war in the Middle East. Although supply chains are responding, you're seeing a lot of diversion around things not going through the Red Sea or the Suez Canal, and so which also could affect shipping prices, which could affect inflation, at least headline inflation. And so, although that might be transitory, the Fed will have a hard time articulating, oh, this is just transitory again,
Can't use that word,
yeah. Yeah, so they have a lot of difficulty dealing with that. So I think this is potentially, I just don't see any positive coming from it. I mean, maybe I'll be wrong and everything will be cleared up over the next year, but the situations, the tense situations that we have and the active wars that we have, I just don't see them being resolved in any way quickly that's going to be helpful.
Yaron, step back, big picture, when you're looking at these kinds of events and where we are now, not just broadly, but right now, what is your takeaway?
My best guess is geopolitical risks can be multiplicative, not just additive. And that's probably why in history we often see some decades of intense geopolitical conflicts and risks around the globe and some decades of relative peacefulness. So what happens in the US in November can of course affect what happens in Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, in Russia, Ukraine, and that they may have implications for macroeconomic outcomes like inflation. So so I think the world is quite connected and in that way fairly complex.
Well, the world is connected. So let's take a look at that global economy. And I want to start with you, Raghu. China recovery. The World Bank put out its global economic report. Was it day before yesterday? No, yesterday. And they're hoping that China, there is a mild recovery. They think the risk is China will get weaker. And of course, if China gets weaker, then every commodity, everybody who exports goods to China, commodities to China, many emerging markets. What do you see for China right now?
Yeah, I think the Chinese engine of growth, which was real estate, is dead in the water. And they've tried to refloat it. It's not happening yet. Now, I think eventually things will start moving up again. But it's taken a lot of time, and we saw with the real estate sector how difficult once it implodes it is to get it back up. I think the other engine of growth, which was substantially increasing exports and the investment to support those exports, that's also something which they have to rethink. And so China is actually looking for a growth model now. And some of the aspects that fed that growth model, they've also undercut. Our colleague, Chang Tai, has this very interesting observation that what worked for China was essentially competition between the various regions. Each region trying to expand growth by changing the rules of the game for their own particular region and championing local firms to grow faster. And some of that has been undercut by the increasing centralization and the anti-corruption drive, because you can't bend the rules selectively. You make yourself vulnerable to being hauled up if you fall outside the good books of the central administration. So everything has been sort of overturned in China, and they're looking for a growth model again. One of the reasons I think why China is much more willing to talk to the US today is simply they don't want to disrupt the one thing that's working, which is exports to the West. And those exports are still, even though everybody is saying China plus one and everybody is looking for an alternative to their China supplier, often it happens to be a supplier in Mexico who's importing from all those suppliers in China. So it's one step removed, but it's still, those supply chains are holding up. I think what the last thing China wants in the world at this point is a total disruption, which is why I think they won't do anything on Taiwan unless pushed. There is some time on that, but of course, these things sometimes don't go along script.
Randy?
Sometimes.
Yeah. So, Randy, when you look at the global economy right now, China's an issue. What do you for 2024? What do you say is the risk, or is everybody kind of waiting for the U.S. not to fall into recession? So, if you look at Japan, not exactly a developing economy, but that's a big deal for them right now as they try to decide if they're going to go ahead with their adjustment in policy and drop yield curve control, et cetera. What's the big global economy issue for you right now?
Well, certainly, I think if we look at Europe broadly, continental Europe, they're facing some real growth challenges. So then inflation is coming down, but not as low as it is here in the U.S. I think the vice president of the ECB just today gave a speech saying, recession is looking pretty likely, and but we still have to hang tough because inflation is still high. So I think that kind of issue that I was talking about for the U.S. I think is even going to be more salient for Europe, where the ECB will have to continue to keep rates where they are. Inflation will come down. It's not quite as low as it is in the U.S. yet, but I think they're facing more challenges. Also, being right on the edge of where the Russia-Ukraine fighting is. That certainly will affect willingness to invest and such. Also, getting back to one of the things that you had mentioned earlier, thinking about AI, Europe is on the way to try to regulate AI.
Yeah.
Now, one of the challenges is we don't know exactly what AI is. And so it's kind of hard in these regulations to come up with, well, what do we mean by artificial intelligence? Because many of the things that we've used in the past, which are just versions of algorithms and computer programs, are forms of AI. So is this going to apply to all of that? And so I think Europe, unfortunately for much of Europe, is going in a direction that they're not going to see the kind of productivity growth that Raghu and I had mentioned is happening here. They're, I think, shooting themselves in the foot, because they're saying, well, there's this big scary thing that's out there, along the lines of what Jeroen was saying, that, and we don't know what it's quite going to be, so we got to stop it. That's a problem, and obviously the people who are more pessimistic on this say, if you wait, it's too late. But I think if you try to stop innovation too early, that's a problem. And I think that kind of culture is one of the reasons why, and that kind of approach is one of the reasons why you don't see very large tech firms in Europe. It's not because people aren't smart or very well educated. There are a lot of super smart people and super well educated people in Europe, a lot of technical skills that are there. But if people want to really build companies, they come to the US because of the regulatory burden and also because of the culture. And so I think that's both a shorter term and a longer term thing that I worry, especially for continental Europe. They think, gosh, we're the smart ones, we're sort of regulating this. And then what do? They try to attack large US firms on antitrust grounds. That doesn't seem like the right way to go.
Yeah. And you slow down the economy, Germany, biggest economy in Europe, what is it, fourth biggest in the world? Anyway, manufacturing. I mean, they're more manufacturing and export dependent, I think, even than China, right? It's a huge part of what drives that economy. I want to throw a different kind, global for you, but another thing the World Bank was worried about that when they look at the risk, it's not at the top, it's not at the front, but they did have it on their list, and that was inflation around the world, that it may not be vanquished. And is that something you see? If I ask you that same question, what's the risk? When you look at the global and you look at the work you do, what's a risk that you see that you're watching, that we should be watching?
I think, as we said before, the biggest risk is probably another big supply shock, and that's connected to geopolitical risks. And so to your questions about the global economy, of course, world peace, there's nothing more important than world peace. And when I read Bloomberg News about, say, China, I'm often reminded of this very famous commercial. A new Coast Guard comes to work and then gets a call from a boat saying, oh, we're sinking. And the Coast Guard says, oh, what are you thinking about? And the end says, improve your English. And so China might be, trying to revive growth, but as we've seen, the policies have become more and more difficult to interpret, sometimes erratic. Maybe we turn left suddenly and then we turn right suddenly. So even as the government tries to pivot this way or the other, probably we need to tolerate more of the difficulty between the market investors and the policymakers to understand each other.
Okay, I've got a very important question on the list from the audience. Anybody can jump in, you can all jump in. What is the AI effect on Chicago Booth MBA graduates moving forward in terms of employment?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why we have done more degrees with the computer science department, joint degrees in data science, because I think people need to have those skills. I mean, you think of something like marketing, which when I started at Booth back before the electric light was invented, as being one of the old folks, marketing was seen as, quote, a soft area, that you didn't use analytics, you didn't use econometrics, and now it's data science. And Booth had been on the cutting edge of that. I mean, we started the Journal of Marketing Science. All of our people in marketing are, really have a very strong, I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people have a very strong econometric background. And so I think I don't think it's just AI in itself. I think that's part of a broader trend of needing more of those technical skills. And that's, in some sense, the world is coming to us. We've always been kind of the more technically oriented, the more framework and oriented school. And so I think the world is just recognizing you need the skills that we have. And we've been expanding in those areas significantly.
One of the advantages of being at the cutting edge is there's not a lot of data at the cutting edge, right?
Okay.
You're innovating. And in that sense, that's probably going to be the last bastion that AI conquers. Not that it won't, but it's... No, I think the broader issue is we really have to sort of work with our students to talk about how AI will be used in corporations. But we also got to use it in our own curricula, right? I know that Steve Kaplan now runs his test through both ChatGPT as well as autonomy is this thing to see if it can be answered by ChatGPT. And he only gives the test once he knows that the questions cannot be answered by AI. But I think going forward, other than just checking if if we're making it too easy for students to run the case through AI and then answer all the questions on the case. I think what would be really useful is, for example, if we have chatbots working as tutors, helping students who are falling behind in certain aspects interact and get some of the answers from that. And that way we bring students up to speed for all the interaction that takes place in classes. So we have to use AI in our work processes also, and that will itself be a part of the learning.
Well, I've been mostly teaching in the flagship undergraduate program that Madhav mentioned to some of you, but I want to make two observations. One is, even several years ago, before the AI wave became big, I asked one of the second-year Booth MBA students, what is the most important thing you've learned at Booth? And he said, it's the importance of data. So I think in that regard, we're quite well prepared. And second is, when we look at technologies make progress, but obviously a very important thing is what we use the technology for. For example, Haber-Bosch method process is responsible for feeding a large fraction of the world's population, but it was also responsible for developing explosives and bombs that killed many people in the world wars, and nuclear physics has a similar story. So how do we use technology to make progress instead of making trouble for ourselves is quite important. That's why we need business schools, not just engineering schools.
There you go. A couple more questions. I'm going to keep pushing until someone says, Kathleen, you got to stop. Because a couple of things we haven't touched on. And one, Raghu, you have a new book out. And India is being more and more recognized and is taking steps itself to become, it's as big as China.
In population.
Exactly.
1/5 in economy.
Right. And it's an uneven economy, right? There's a lot of poverty still, but there's so much. There's a stronger middle class. There's science. There's so much. What is the message in your book? What is the message we're going to find when we read your book out very soon?
I mean, the simple message is don't be like China. It's find an Indian way, and what is the East Asian way of growth, which focus on manufacturing-led exports. Start with unskilled labor in manufacturing, move up this value chain over time, and then become a workshop to the world. That's what China did. And what I'm saying is China's already there. You can't do it the same way. The West is very resistant to, seeing another China decimate its industries. What you really need to do is focus on your strengths. And India has a lot of strengths in services, made much more possible because of what's happened during the pandemic and after. Exactly what Randy said. If you don't go to work today in Chicago, and you can do your work from home in your Chicago office without showing up, you can do that work from Bangalore in the Chicago office, right? You can do work at a distance in a much greater way today, and companies understand that. And they're actually looking for those employees across the world. There are, these things called global capability centers, which are opening all the time. The biggest office that Goldman Sachs has outside North America is in Bangalore, 8,500 employees. These are not the old guys doing, back office work. These guys are doing front office work now. They're collaborating with partners inside the front office. In the West, it's happening in consulting, it's happening in accounting, it's happening in legal services, across the board. The problem is finding enough Indians who can do that. You might say, what's the problem? You've got 1.4 billion people, but of course, only a small fraction are trained to the level that the people in this room are trained. Many of, a number of them are Booth alums who've gone back. But we need far more. And what I'm saying really in the book is trying to say we need to focus much more, not on building factories, but on building universities, building schools, building hospitals, focusing on building capabilities, the human capital that can then service the world. And a lot of it is going to be services, but increasingly manufacturing is also a huge number of embedded services. The Tesla, for example, has 40 million lines of code. That's a huge amount of value, not in bits and pieces, in physical stuff, but in software. And I think this is happening across the board. It's something that is important for India to cotton on to. And it is an entirely different pathway of growth, which I think it's possible for it to be win-win with the West. And I think this is where India's democracy is also a strength. I hate to see the erosion of democracy, and I want to make the case that democracy is really important for India in its growth path going forward.
Randy, that makes me think of another question we can touch on here about productivity that came in while we were talking about what do you think is driving the recent increase in productivity? Can these higher levels of productivity be sustained without greater increases in wage inflation later this decade as the boomers retire? Although there's a lot more being written about how a lot of boomers are even coming back from retirement because they've had too much golf, or you can only watch so much Netflix. But because I'm thinking the kind of stuff you're talking about drives productivity, right? And so I think this is a question focused on the U.S., but it's a very important question broadly.
Oh, for sure. It's the key question globally, because ultimately economic growth is the number of hours worked and the output per hour, productivity. This is one of the reasons why China is facing both a short-term problem with in the financial markets and in the property markets, but also they're aging very, very rapidly. The number of the fraction of working age population is declining actually faster than Japan's did after its peak, and so you're just not going to see the kind of growth that China had from before. And getting back to, Raghu had mentioned one of our colleagues, Chiang Tai-shek, who's done a lot of, with co-authors, who's done a lot of work on productivity within China. No surprise, what he finds is the firms that are primarily private firms have higher productivity than the ones that have state intervention or state control. Obviously, Xi has chosen to go further in the state control direction. That's a real problem for China, because you got this 1-2 punch of the number of people the number of potential workers is declining very rapidly. They have a lot, but a lot of the growth in the past had come from that growth, and now the output per hour is not going to grow at the same rate that it was before. In the short run, it's very difficult to know exactly what's driving productivity growth issues. I mean, we had this sort of paradox for a long time that it seemed that we had a lot of innovation, we had the internet, and productivity growth was very low. Then it subsequently came. Why we're seeing it so high now, I think that's a bit of a paradox, or I shouldn't say a bit of a paradox, a bit of a conundrum, that we don't know exactly what's driving that. Some of it also could be from, I think it's a little bit more difficult to measure the number of hours when people are working from home, and so I think that had been an issue before. Now people are used to working from home, getting a little bit better data on that, and so maybe we are seeing some reasonable productivity from that. But also I think people working a lot and not reporting. So, they're working 8 hours, or they say they're working 8 hours, but they're really working 9 or 10, and maybe not fully reporting that because they're answering those emails at 2 a.m. or on Saturday and on Sunday.
I'm a terrible work from home person. Oh, I'm awful. I get distracted so easily, and I need to get out of the house. Anyway.
I want to say two things. One is about the measurement of productivity, touching on what Randy just said. Measurement of productivity is not simple at all. And one of the important questions that we face right now is, for example, when AI comes around, or new forms of technologies that are different from traditional physical investment, firms may be investing in these new technologies not in a physical way, shape, and form, and therefore it doesn't go into investment, it goes into expenses like labor and so on. And if it goes to expenses, it tends to decrease the measured near-term productivity and output. But then in the future, these investments may pay off and increase future output, and therefore there may be difficulty in measuring productivity, especially as we face new technologies that are more intangible in nature. And the other is about the determinants of technology. And as we know, productivity is not just a simple function of technology, it also depends a lot on institutions. So one specific example is some interesting recent work Austin has been involved in, other economists have been involved in documenting that productivity growth in construction in the US has been sluggish for several decades. And if you look at construction costs in the US, that's much higher than construction costs in comparable advanced economies. Why is productivity growth so sluggish in construction? Some attribute it to over-regulation that limits the size of construction firms and their ability to use advanced technologies. And the other more general example is, as we know, institutions and democracy that Regu mentioned is quite important. You can take North Korea as an extreme example. Technology is there, but with their institutions, you're not going to get productivity growth in North Korea out of the modern technologies. So democracy is important.
Yes, it's very important. In terms of an audience question that came in the spirit of economic forecast, I'd love to hear each panelist share their forecast for U.S. GDP growth for 2024. And I'm going to modify that question slightly for Yaron so she can give us a sense of how those sort of disparities work out with GDP. But you can give a GDP forecast too. But let's see. Okay, Raghu Rajan, what are you looking for GDP? And inflation. I want to throw in inflation. I know. Well, you're
you know, it's going to slow. We had a spectacular year this one, so 1.5.
Yeah,
1.5, okay.
that's where the median forecast is. I think it's reasonable.
Oh, no wonder he said that.
Right.
But again, as I said, a lot of things are difficult to measure. And so the output could be higher than what's being measured. It could be lower than what's being measured, but
Something around there. Yeah, and that's not quite strong enough for, well, it's not a recession, and it just seems kind of ho-hum, Randy. Is that what you're looking for too?
Ho-hum. I think that's my forecast for the level. Will be ho-hum. I think it'll be positive, but and that's why my hardish landing is that we'll just have very, very low growth. So probably one handle on it, and the unemployment rate moving up certainly into the 4s and potentially even with a 5 handle, but I think into the 4s.
Okay, well, I got a one-word message here. It says, please, in big letters. So I think maybe, please, they want me to thank this wonderful panel. And
and thank our moderator also.
I would say that moderating is, especially when you have a panel like this, it's like you're a lion tamer in the middle of the ring, and all you really have to do, seriously, you just tap them here, tap them there, and they just keep going. And it's a pleasure, it's easy, and this is always such a great audience. I love coming here. Everyone's so, you're a great group. You're a great group, and you can feel that energy here at Booth. I certainly feel it whenever I come here. So thank you again for inviting me.